Hey, Donald CSGO here, and I want to talk about consistency. Now, consistency is something that everyone should strive for. However, depending on your level, and depending especially on the type of game you play, matchmaking pugs or scrims with a real team, it may not even be optimal. Now, to begin with here, you need to understand that there's two types of consistency. You can name these whatever you want, but I'm going to call them consistency in performance and in outcome. So performance is what you can control, and outcome is the way you actually, a lot of the time, will measure that consistency. You could have perfect consistency in performance, but that doesn't always necessarily mean the outcome is going to be the same, and you do need to be able to understand that. Now, with that being said, there are certainly some things you can try and do in-game to minimize that inconsistency as much as possible. Now, the most obvious way to begin is something I tell most newer players that ask about consistency: you need to get better. Unfortunately, the reality is that low-ranked players and just inexperienced players in general are simply not going to be consistent because you have gaps in your gameplay that you simply don't understand or you may not even notice. For example, if I look at this round here from Jack1224, not to throw you under the bus here, Jack, I'm sorry, but you can see this play where he runs up banana at the beginning of the round. Now, I've shown this in another video because it's a great example of mistakes that people typically make. There are about 5 or 6 different ways his opponents could have played that would have ended up with him dying here. However, it did work out for him this time around. He gets the kill, he almost gets a second, but you can certainly envision many different ways his opponents could have played that would have gotten him killed. And this is where inconsistency is going to be most obvious. You leave a gap in the way you're playing the game, and your opponents simply will not consistently exploit that. And that means some games are going to do well and others you'll do poorly. So at the very top of the pyramid, the first thing you want to do is at the bottom. So at the very bottom of the pyramid, you want to make sure that this is the first thing you're trying to remedy. Now, especially if we take a look at a professional game with this idea in mind, you're actually going to start to notice that a ton of things that pros are doing, it's specifically designed to be less inconsistent. They flash every angle, they molly every angle, they deal with every potential opposing player location, and that's because consistency is something you can absolutely strive for when you're with a professional team. However, if you watch the same pro players playing in a pug, you're going to notice they don't have the same level of coordination. They try and manage it as much as possible, but to some extent, you simply can't find consistency in a pug. Now, one of the things that I think is a problem is that people think that being perfectly consistent is the end goal. And, well, sure, I mean, that would be great. However, I've been critical of people in the past that play too safe. If you watch my video on Koi, who I think deserves a rank up to level 10, one of the problems he had is I felt he was playing too perfect. And when you leave opportunities for your teammates to mess things up, they will. Just about every time. Sometimes you do need to take risks, and that's going to allow you to carry your games more effectively. The more impact you have, the more you're going to carry your teams, and that's why Leadify's rating system is based off of impact. So to some extent, it's a balancing act. When you're playing with a pug, you don't want to play too passive and try and deal with every possibility, because with a pug, it's simply not possible. However, on the other end, you don't want to be running in like Jack did, not clearing your angles, and leaving yourself open to a ton of different ways you could die. Similarly, if we look at this player, Rosie, who runs out the long A doors on Dust 2, which simply aren't big enough for 2 people, you can see that some mistakes are being made there. An example of a play that's risky but worth taking is this play from Zinkern on Mirage. Now, this is a play you will see professional players go for, running quickly up towards Cat through the smokes and being willing to take the fight on the player in connector. This is something you want to be doing because otherwise that connector player can feel too comfortable and play in a way that you really don't want to let them play. This is a lot of what makes Furia so good as a team. They really push to the edge of possibilities and make you respect that anything could happen. Of course, that's not going to be perfectly consistent the way Astralis was up until they sold the Vice. However, it is something that you want to be doing in general. These risky plays, while inconsistent, aren't bad plays. If you look at the Rosie play, she's going long A with one of the weaker spawns, which means the CTs could and should already be set up by the time she gets there. It's very common to molly and nade in long doors, which would blow up before she even got outdoors as well, so likely to take a bunch of free damage. And typically the engagements aren't really based around a timing that she's beating. The way these types of pushing the limit plays work is you try and push a timing to the limit of what your opponents are expecting. So you run directly up to top banana on Inferno to catch someone off that's throwing utility. You run through the top mid smoke on Mirage to catch someone that's running connector but isn't quite there yet. You don't run out long A late. And so that brings us to consistency in performance, and this is what you're really hoping for. While your consistency in outcome isn't going to be perfect every game, you can try and be perfectly consistent on your own level. The problem is, you're a human, and many pro players have talked about this not really being possible. Some days you're not going to be playing at 100%. Elige has talked about this as the A, B, and C game. Device has talked about this before, talking about playing at 100%. Many pros have talked about this where you simply need to understand that you're not going to be at the same level every single day, even if you try your best. So there are a variety of different things that you can do to try and mitigate this inconsistency that's just innate to being human if you're not simple. The first and most obvious thing is to try and make sure that you're minimizing the amount you need to use your mechanics to get you out of situations. Your mechanics aren't going to be perfectly consistent, and so the more you rely on them, the less consistent you're going to be. This is specifically why entry fraggers are almost never consistent. You only have a fraction of a second to actually turn and kill your opponent, and unless your mechanics are perfectly on point, you're simply not going to be doing so, and that's not going to be consistent from day to day. Of course, that goes on top of the fact that they have too many angles to clear and oftentimes will simply be caught off guard. So the main thing you want to be doing is try and minimize the amount you're using your mechanics if you can help it. And that means having things like good crosshair placement, good movement, just generally making it easy for you to get kills, not having yourself constantly in positions where you need to aim yourself out of a bad spot. The less bad spots you're in, the easier the shots you have to land are, the more you're going to be able to land those even on a bad day. But, and here we get to the part that's really hard to do until you get to a very high level, is to be very comfortable switching up roles and switching up positions that you're comfortable playing. Again, I mentioned Elige and Device. Device's quote, I believe, was that you want to make sure that even if you're playing at 80%, you want to get 100% out of it.
Can I say something smart again?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not about the 100%, but it's about if you have 80%, you have to use 100% of the 80%. So if you know you have 80%, then there's also like focus going into knowing I have 80% today.
And that's what most people do wrong. Instead of realizing they're not having a good day and playing to that level, they try and play as if they're having a perfect day and they just get destroyed. So what you want is the ability to change your playstyle a little bit when things are going wrong and when you know it's simply not a day that's going your way. Do you need to be taking an aim duel in this spot? A lot of the time you could play a little bit more passive, a little bit more safe in a scenario where things are simply not going your way and you would be better off for it. So when things are going your way, you can adjust accordingly and deal with things that way. This is also something people really misunderstand, and I think it's a reason people often think they're playing with a lot more smurfs than they are. People at low rank can have pop-off games when they're doing really well and they're hitting all of their shots, especially when their opponents aren't countering them or just playing the positions they're not checking. That doesn't necessarily mean they're smurfing. A lot of the time, this is just a player, as Valve says, having a really good day.